Tonight, we softly step into the bleak and hungry world of the Great European Famine. Imagine barren fields, empty stomachs, and the desperate fight just to survive, where lasting even a single day was a battle against starvation and hardship. Settle in, relax, and let this gentle story of endurance and sorrow carry you peacefully into sleep. The shadow of the Great Famine. There was a time in medieval Europe when the land that once brimmed with life and abundance fell silent, stripped bare by a cruel twist of fate. A time when the very soil beneath the plow seemed to betray those who depended on it, and the skies themselves conspired against the people with relentless cold and unyielding rain. This was not a momentary hardship, nor a passing season of want. It was a slow, creeping shadow that swallowed entire communities in despair. This shadow is known to history as the Great Famine. Imagine standing on the edge of a small village, nestled in the rolling hills and patchwork fields that have supported generations. The familiar sounds of daily life, birdsong, children's laughter, the rhythmic clatter of tools, grow faint, replaced by a heavy stillness. In the heart of this village, the granaries stand ominously quiet. The wooden beams creak softly in the damp air, but the storage bins once brimming with grain now lie nearly empty. The scent of fresh earth and growing crops, usually a promise of nourishment to come, is missing. Instead, a damp mustiness lingers, a silent testament to the harvests that never came. This silence was terrifying. It was the silence of empty bellies and fading hope. It marked the beginning of a struggle not just against hunger, but against the very breakdown of a way of life. Across the countryside, farmers had sown their fields with care, relying on traditions passed down through centuries, planting rye, barley, and wheat in careful rotation to keep the soil fertile. But this year, the rains did not come and go in the familiar pattern. They lingered and poured, washing away seeds before they could sprout and drowning the fragile shoots barely breaking through the earth. Without the sun's warmth to coax life from the soil, the crops failed in heartbreaking silence. The fields, once green with promise, became mud and rot. What little grain was harvested was quickly consumed or hoarded, but the stores were too small, the need too great. The fragility of a localized system. For the people of medieval Europe, survival was bound tightly to the land. This was a world before industrial agriculture, before mechanized farming or global food trade. Each village, each family, depended on what they could grow, gather, or raise within a day's walk. There were no supermarkets to visit when the pantry was bare, no trucks to bring food from distant regions spared by the same disaster. The entire system was local, fragile, and deeply vulnerable. Within this precarious balance, the social structure shaped who lived and who perished. At the top were the lords, powerful landowners who controlled estates and commanded allegiance. The church, with its moral and economic influence, collected tithes from the peasants, claiming a tenth of their harvest as a sacred duty. Below them were the peasants themselves, farmers, laborers, and serfs, who worked the soil yet owned little beyond their own calloused hands. For the peasants, the harvest was more than a bounty. It was a contract written in blood and sweat. They owed rents and taxes in grain, livestock, or labor to their lords, and tithe payments to the church, even in times of hardship. This meant that when the fields failed, peasants still faced the impossible choice of surrendering what little they had or facing punishment, eviction, or worse. Their survival depended not only on the crops but on the fragile grace of those above them. As famine deepened, local markets, places where families might trade surplus or purchase food, withered. Prices soared beyond reach, and food scarcity became a constant specter. The barns and communal granaries that once promised some security for the community were emptied rapidly. Neighbors, once bound by mutual aid, began to compete desperately for scraps. Hunger, disease, and social breakdown. The effects of hunger rippled outward like shockwaves. Bodies weakened and fell ill. Diseases once manageable in healthy populations now spread unchecked through malnourished communities. Mothers watched helplessly as children grew gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Whole villages saw a terrifying rise in mortality. Yet, the famine was not just a physical struggle. It was a test of human spirit and social cohesion. Some communities fractured under the pressure, while others found strength in shared sacrifice and resilience. The stories passed down tell of families torn apart by starvation, but also of neighbors who gave their last morsels to strangers. It was a world where survival demanded courage, endurance, and often a merciless dose of luck. To live through the Great Famine, even for a single day, meant facing a landscape transformed from one of plenty to one of desperate scarcity. It meant confronting hunger that gnawed at the body and hope that flickered dangerously low. It was a time when the very meaning of community was challenged, and where the divisions of power shaped the line between life and death. This shadow cast by the Great European Famine is a powerful reminder of how fragile human life and society can be when nature turns against us. It teaches us to remember the strength required to endure the darkest times, and the deep cost of a world where a day's survival is never guaranteed. The climate turns against them. The little ice age begins. The sun, once warm and faithful, began to betray its rhythm. There were no sudden signs, no thunderous announcements from the skies. But over time, the mornings grew dimmer, the rains more persistent, the seasons less reliable. What had been steady for generations, spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, was quietly undone by a world whose balance began to falter. It was not a cataclysm. It was a whisper of cold that stretched into a murmur of storms, into a conversation of rot, and eventually, into a chorus of hunger. Fields that had always yielded barely enough now yielded far less. Peasants, whose calendars revolved around sowing and reaping, looked skyward with confusion and dread. The familiar cycles betrayed them. Rains came not as blessing but as punishment, soaking the earth beyond usefulness. Crops refused to ripen. Grain heads drooped under too heavy clouds, and entire plantings lay rotting in place. The soil, once obedient, now swallowed seed and labor alike, offering little in return. This climatic shift, what modern understanding would later call the beginnings of the Little Ice Age, was not an apocalypse. It was worse in its subtlety. Its cruelty was in its uncertainty, its refusal to follow rules. There were still warm days, but they were followed by sudden frosts or endless deluges. The growing season shortened by mere weeks, yet those lost weeks unraveled entire communities. The Great Hunger did not arise from a single failed harvest, but from the accumulation of disappointments. People endured one bad season, even two, but when the third arrived with no reprieve, even hope began to curdle. Villagers huddled in their homes and listened to the rain like a drumbeat of warning. Roofs leaked. Thatched cottages became damp and mildew-ridden. In barns, hay molded. Grain spoiled. Food was not only hard to grow, it became hard to preserve. Those who had set aside stores found them souring before they could be eaten. Hunger set in like a guest who refused to leave. The animals sensed it too. Pigs grew thin on spoiled feed. Cattle collapsed under weakened legs. Horses, once strong enough to plow hardened fields, faltered as their ribs became visible beneath their hides. When people could no longer feed their beasts, they slaughtered them. But meat is not a harvest. It does not return in the spring. It is a one-time mercy. And soon, even that mercy ran out. Wood, which once warmed homes and boiled stews, was soaked and unburnable. The forests, dense with trees, offered little comfort when everything was wet and mold crept into walls and bones. With every meal skipped, with every failed seed, the world closed in tighter. Nature had shifted, imperceptibly at first, but with a growing authority that no king or priest could challenge. No one knew the term climate change, but everyone knew suffering. Elders who had seen many winters shook their heads and said they had never seen a spring like this one. Priests preached that sins had turned the heavens against the earth. Some believed the devil walked among the crops. Others believed it was a test. Most simply understood that they were starving. The human body is remarkably resilient, until it is not. Malnutrition begins quietly. Fatigue becomes constant. Cuts refuse to heal. The smallest cold becomes a sentence. Children, once energetic and full of mischief, began to slow. Their eyes dulled. They clung to mothers who had nothing left to give. The old became burdens, and then, memories. When people could no longer grow food, they scavenged. Wild herbs, mushrooms, bark, anything the forest might give. The knowledge of what could be eaten returned like a desperate instinct. Nettles, thistles, and acorns, unthinkable in times of plenty, became staples. But nature's charity is limited. The forest feeds only so many, and it hides poisons among its blessings. Mistaken roots, bitter berries, a misidentified fungus. Desperation is a poor guide. Communities turned inward. Hospitality vanished. Doors once open to travelers were now bolted shut. A beggar was no longer a neighbor, but a threat. Stories emerged of mothers feeding their children before themselves, of fathers disappearing into the woods and never returning. Rumors spread of theft from church stores, of neighbors stealing seed grain in the night. Trust eroded like the banks of an overflowing stream. What the people of this time could not see, what no parchment or priest could record, was the quiet, global scale of the suffering. It was not just their village. Entire regions across the continent shared their despair. Rivers flooded, roads vanished beneath mud, trade slowed to a trickle. Even the cities, with their wealth and grain reserves, began to tremble. Hunger does not respect stone walls. Markets, once bustling centers of exchange, now resembled open-air tombs. Traders had nothing to bring. Bakers, unable to find flour, closed their shutters. The smell of fresh bread, once the heart of any town morning, faded from memory. Where coins had once bought loaves, now they bought nothing. A sack of grain became worth more than gold, and still there were no sacks to be found. The church bells still rang. Monasteries prayed, but faith was no defense against famine. Even holy men required food. Monasteries that had grown wealthy on tithes found themselves feeding entire villages from dwindling stores. Charity battled necessity, and the line between them blurred. People came for help. Then they came with desperation. Then they stopped coming entirely. The rhythms of life, birth, marriage, harvest, feast, stuttered. Weddings were delayed. Infants were buried before they could be baptized. Festivals were canceled. And yet, the seasons kept turning. Winter still came, but with less wood. Spring arrived, but nothing grew. Time moved forward, dragging the starving with it. In the damp silence of an unlit cottage, a child would ask when the bread would come. And a mother, who no longer believed in bread, would whisper, soon, not as promise but as lullaby. Outside, the wind would carry the scent of wet earth and something darker. It would rattle loose shutters. It would sweep through empty barns and whisper through the trees. This was not the end of the world, but it was the end of the world as they had known it. A slow, sodden unraveling. A betrayal not by man or beast, but by the sky itself. And through it all, the people endured, not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. Survival became an act of quiet rebellion against a climate no longer friendly, a world no longer predictable. You would not have lasted a day. Medieval farming practices, strengths and vulnerabilities. The field, long before the famine, had been the heart of survival. It was not simply a place where grain grew, it was the calendar, the economy, the very breath of the peasant world. A single acre of land could mean the difference between a full winter or a death wrapped in frost. In the early 14th century, farming was not an occupation. It was existence, and like existence, it was always precarious. Medieval agriculture had evolved over centuries of necessity. Most peasants lived in manorial villages, with communal strips of land worked according to local custom. Fields were divided into long, narrow sections, parceled out to each family. It was a system born from fairness and from hardship. Each family received a piece of every type of land, some fertile, some stony, some nearly useless. No one received the best or the worst entirely. Misery and hope were shared equally. The plow and sowing, labor-intensive beginnings. At the core of this system was the heavy plow, pulled by oxen. It carved through the thick, clay-rich soil of northern Europe. But it was not efficient. It required teams, often 4 or more beasts, and the collaboration of families. A single plow team was not just expensive, it was a rare communal possession, passed between neighbors as needed. Without it, turning the soil after a long winter was nearly impossible. Seeds were broadcast by hand, thrown over the plowed ground with hope more than precision. There was no fertilizer in the modern sense. Instead, farmers relied on animal manure, left to rot and then scattered in the fields. Crop yields were painfully low. For every grain sown, only 3 or 4 returned. In good years, this was enough. In bad years, it was ruinous. The 3-field system and core crops. The rhythm of planting and harvesting was determined by the 3-field system. It was considered a great innovation at the time. 1/3 of the land was planted with winter wheat or rye. Another third with spring crops like barley, oats, or legumes. The final third lay fallow, allowed to rest and recover its nutrients. This rotation helped reduce soil exhaustion, but it also meant that only 2/3 of the available land was used at any time. In a world where mouths multiplied faster than fields could expand, this was both necessary and insufficient. Rye, barley, wheat, these were not luxuries. They were life itself. Bread made from these grains formed the bulk of the medieval diet. Vegetables, when available, played a secondary role. Meat was a rare indulgence for peasants, often reserved for feasts or stolen from a lord's woods at great personal risk. Dairy could supplement, but milk was perishable. Eggs were precious. Honey sweetened the rare treat. But it was grain, especially rye and wheat, that filled the stomach and kept the cold at bay. Population growth and environmental strain. Even in times of relative stability, the agricultural system bent under the weight of growing populations. Villages spilled into forests, marshes were drained, and hillsides were cleared in desperate efforts to expand arable land. But the soil was not endlessly forgiving. Marginal lands quickly gave diminishing returns. What remained became overworked, fragile. When the weather shifted, when the rain stayed, when the sun retreated, these lands offered nothing in return. Population growth outpaced innovation. The early 14th century was a time of crowding. Fields were already maximized, and so too were labor and land. Peasants could not afford to leave land fallow for too long. They planted again and again, pushing the soil to give more than it could. When yields fell, they had no margin. And when climate change began to creep in, when the Little Ice Age's damp chill took root, it pushed this already fragile system to the edge. Primitive tools and vulnerable harvests. Agricultural tools had not changed significantly for centuries. The sickle and the scythe, the flail and the spade, simple iron implements passed from father to son. They were extensions of the body, not machines. There was no mechanization, no buffer against human fatigue. Planting, weeding, harvesting, all required sweat, skill, and timing. And when the weather made timing impossible, even skill could not save a crop. Peasants did not measure yield by surplus. They measured it by survival. A good harvest filled the granary and fed the family. A poor harvest meant stretching grain with wild roots, boiling thinner porridge, and hoping next season would be kinder. There were no silos of plenty. Grain was stored in sacks or wooden bins, vulnerable to rot, rats, and theft. A single leak in the roof could ruin a family's year. When the climate began to shift, it did so slowly, but its impact was cumulative and relentless. Late springs meant late plantings. Unseasonal rains drowned seeds. Hailstorms flattened delicate shoots. Mold crept in. Blights took hold. And the meager tools of medieval farming had no answer. A man could plow, but he could not command the sun. A woman could sow, but she could not banish the cold. Livestock suffering and manorial limitations. Livestock, which supported the farm in dozens of subtle ways, providing milk, manure, labor, also suffered. Wet summers meant poor hay, and poor hay meant weak animals come winter. Oxen grew thin and slow. Sheep, soaked and shivering, provided less wool. Pigs rooted in muddy pens, becoming a drain rather than a source of food. And with no meat to spare, few dared slaughter their animals. Doing so was a gamble on the future, a desperate exchange of tomorrow's work for today's meal. In manorial economies, peasants could not shift to new crops or techniques at will. Innovation was rare and risky. Lords demanded rents regardless of conditions. A peasant who failed to produce enough grain could not simply experiment with beans or try new rotations. The feudal contract allowed for little deviation. Serfs were bound not only to the land, but to its expectations. And in a world where deviation could mean punishment or eviction, most had no choice but to repeat the practices of their ancestors, even when those practices no longer served. The unmasking of an exhausted system. The vulnerabilities of the system were many: an over-reliance on a narrow set of grains, an inflexible system of land tenure, primitive tools, and a climate-dependent calendar. But these were not failures of ignorance. They were the result of centuries of survival in a world without alternatives. Medieval farmers did not lack wisdom. They lacked options. As the climate betrayed them and the population pressed against the limits of production, the tension snapped. The Great Famine was not merely a failure of food. It was the unmasking of an exhausted system. When the harvest failed once, people prayed. When it failed twice, they despaired. When it failed 3 times, they died. The silence in the fields grew louder than the sound of bells. The sickle rusted. The plow sat idle. Granaries echoed with emptiness. And all the strength of medieval agriculture, all its toil and sweat and heritage, was not enough. You would not have lasted a day. The social structure: lords, peasants, and their fragile interdependence. The land was everything, and those who owned it held the lives of others in their grasp. In the medieval world, social order was not flexible. It was fixed, rigid, ordained by tradition and sanctified by faith. It was a pyramid with wide, burdened shoulders at its base and a narrow peak gleaming at the top. Lords, peasants, and priests lived in a carefully choreographed interdependence, but only some held the power to survive collapse. Others, most others, would fall when the system faltered. At the top stood the king, but his hand rarely touched the soil. Below him were the nobles, barons, and knights, landed men who derived wealth and power from vast tracts of farmland. These lords did not farm, they owned. They collected, they demanded. In exchange for military loyalty or political allegiance, the king granted them land, huge estates divided into manors. And those manors were worked not by free citizens, but by the peasantry, many of whom were bound to the soil as serfs. These peasants, villagers, laborers, men and women born to toil, made up over 90% of the population. They worked fields they did not own, harvesting grain they could not keep, raising animals they could be forbidden to slaughter. They owed taxes in labor and produce. They paid rents to their lords, tithes to the church, and dues to their village. Even when the harvest was lean or failed entirely, their obligations did not retreat. The structure held firm, even as their stomachs emptied. The burden of obligation. A peasant's year was one of obligation. A portion of their week was given not to their own strip of land, but to the lord's demesne, the section of the estate directly managed by the noble. There, they plowed and sowed and reaped for someone else's table. Then came church dues, the sacred tenth, 1 out of every 10 sheaves of grain, 1 lamb out of every 10 born, 1/10 of honey, cheese, eggs, and effort. The church, too, relied on grain to fund its priests, maintain its abbeys, feed its poor. But it took before it gave. In a good year, this was sustainable. In a famine year, it was ruin. Markets played their part. Local fairs and village gatherings offered a fragile cushion. A peasant might barter eggs for linen or sell excess beans for iron tools. But these markets were small and highly localized. And when harvests failed across entire regions, they became scenes of desperation. Bread, when found, could cost a month's wages. Animals were sold off for a fraction of their worth. Tools pawned, clothing traded. Hunger turned every corner into a marketplace, and every marketplace into a battlefield of need. The church held more than just spiritual authority. It owned land, vast acres, and managed them with the same expectations as a secular lord. Monasteries employed reeves and bailiffs, collected rent, and stored grain in abbey granaries. It prayed for rain or sun, but it also punished non-payment. And while many clergy did offer charity, bowls of pottage for the poor, shelter for widows, the institution as a whole depended on the same food system as the lords. It was not designed to feed a failing world. It was designed to maintain hierarchy within it, vulnerability and uneven survival. In a typical village, a peasant family's entire livelihood might rest on a few narrow strips of land, a single cow, and their capacity to endure. These were not lazy or ignorant people. Their knowledge of the soil was intimate. They could read the sky, the leaves, the pulse of the earth. But they had no reserves, no insurance. Their granary might feed them through winter, if the harvest had been good. If it hadn't, they diluted their bread with bark, acorns, or weeds. They rationed their children's meals. And still they owed. As the famine took hold, the social structure did not bend to absorb the blow. Lords increased demands in kind, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of desperation. They needed rents to pay soldiers, fund feasts, or repay debts. Priests continued to collect tithes, citing divine justice. The hierarchy pressed downward. Those at the bottom had no one to press upon. Only hunger pressed them. Some fled. Vagabonds filled the roads. Former peasants, now homeless and wandering, seeking work or food in towns that could not support them. Others stole. The forests, once dangerous but abundant, became poached and bare. Foraging became a crime. Executions for theft rose, even as bread vanished from tables. It was not that society lacked food entirely, but rather that it lacked flexibility. What food remained was kept by those with wealth, rank, or connections. Even within the village, survival was uneven. Those who served as reeves or bailiffs, agents of the Lord, might receive better rations or first claim to grain. The blacksmith might trade his services for food. The midwife might be paid in bread. But the day laborer, the widow, the orphan, they stood last in line. In famine, order held, but compassion weakened. Hunger made neighbors into rivals. The irony of feudalism and enduring hardship. Some manors had granaries built for lean years, but they were limited and rarely enough. By the second year of failed crops, even the best-stocked lords faced shortages. And when they did, they often tightened their grip rather than loosened it. The structure did not collapse. It persisted, coldly, blindly, under the weight of human suffering. The irony of feudalism was its dependence on those it burdened most. Without the peasants, there was no harvest. Without the harvest, there was no rent. Without rent, the manor crumbled. Yet the system gave peasants no agency. They could not choose to plant different crops, migrate elsewhere, or refuse payment. The very structure that needed their labor also denied them the tools to survive when labor alone could not sustain them. A peasant could be punished for failing to deliver grain that no longer grew. He could be jailed for theft of food he once produced. The law was not written in hunger's language. It was written in obligation's ink. There were moments of solidarity. Some villages tried to distribute grain communally. Some lords forgave rents, or the church opened its stores. But these were exceptions. Charity came slowly, often after the worst had passed. The system, in most places, expected obedience, not adaptation. To live as a peasant at the bottom of this pyramid was to be always vulnerable, to rain, to frost, to disease, but most of all to the rigid expectations of the system itself. Hunger could have been answered with compassion, but often it was met with collection agents. And still, they endured, because they had no choice. Children were born, seeds were planted, prayers were whispered over cold loaves. The field still called them each spring, even when it had nothing left to give. But you, dropped into that world, your hands uncalloused, your back unused to bending, your stomach demanding variety and warmth, you would not last the day. The system would not make room for you. The bread would not reach you. The structure would not protect you. It would only remind you, quietly, ruthlessly, that in this world, survival belonged to those at the top. And at the bottom, you would feel the full weight of the pyramid, pressing down with the cold indifference of tradition. Early signs: failed harvests and rising prices. It began not with screams, but with silence. The kind of silence that blankets a village when the fields fail to sing. No rustling of stalks in the wind, no busy shuffle of harvesters in rows of gold. Just wet, beaten earth where wheat should have danced in the sunlight. The first signs of trouble whispered into rural life long before the bells of alarm were sounded by kings or priests. For the ordinary people of medieval Europe, the warning came as an ache in the stomach, a heavier load on the oxen, and the slow realization that the seasons were no longer predictable friends. Farmers, accustomed to reading the soil and sky as second nature, began to notice something was wrong. The rains had lingered too long. The seeds rotted before they had a chance to sprout. When they did grow, they grew thin and pale, stalks too weak to stand, too fragile to yield. Villagers stared at their plots and prayed, but no sun came. In the lowlands, water pooled at the edges of fields where grain should have ripened. The drainage systems of the time, mostly hand-dug ditches and small canals, proved no match for the sheer relentlessness of the weather. In more fortunate years, when one harvest failed, people might look to the next village, the next county, the next year. But these failures weren't isolated. They crept across regions like a dark fog. Farmers began returning from their fields empty-handed. Markets that once bustled with sacks of grain and fresh vegetables now stood half empty. Prices began to rise, not all at once, but gradually, like water rising in a barrel with no outlet. At first, it was noticed only by the poor, who watched the price of a loaf stretch beyond what a day's labor could buy. Then even the merchants began to worry. Barter gave way to desperation. People who once traded wool for bread began offering tools, even clothing. Mothers tried to stretch what little grain they had, watering down porridge, feeding their children and pretending not to be hungry themselves. But hunger cannot be reasoned with. It gnaws in the night, it steals strength during the day. A father's ability to work a field weakens with each skipped meal. A child's laughter disappears when there is nothing to chew. Impact on lords and towns. The lords, too, began to feel the shift, though not in their bellies, but in their ledgers. Their tithes and rents were still expected, but the flow of grain owed to them dwindled. They blamed lazy peasants, cursed the sky, punished those who withheld their dues. Yet their barns did not fill. In castle kitchens, the stews grew thinner, the portions smaller. Wealth could delay hunger, but not indefinitely. In towns, the streets grew tense. Bakers, cornered by soaring flour costs, began hoarding what they could, or hiking prices until only the wealthy could afford bread. This in turn bred resentment. Riots flickered in marketplaces. Grain convoys were attacked. It became dangerous to be seen carrying bread. People began hiding their food, not just from thieves, but from neighbors they had once trusted. Hunger, it seemed, did not care for friendships. And yet, for a time, people held out hope. They told stories of bad years followed by good ones. They looked to the church, which offered fasting and prayer, penance and pilgrimage. But even the priests began to wonder why their prayers were met with silence. The bells tolled for mass, but also for funerals, more frequently than anyone wished to count. The slow creep of disaster. What made these early signs so devastating was their deceptive pace. This was not a famine that swept through in a matter of weeks. It crept. A poor harvest one year was tolerable. 2 in a row could be survived, barely. But as each season failed to bring relief, the system frayed. Reserves, already minimal in most households, were spent. Tools were pawned. Animals were slaughtered early, not in celebration, but in fear. Eating a cow meant no milk tomorrow, but tomorrow was not promised. The elderly were the first to go hungry, often by choice. They stepped aside at the dinner pot, insisting the young eat instead. Some wandered away from home, quietly hoping their absence would mean one less mouth to feed. Children, who had once run through meadows with sticky fingers and laughter, began to shrink into themselves, quiet, pale, listless. Births slowed. Deaths increased. The village population thinned even before the worst had begun. As prices continued their rise, money itself became strange. A silver coin that once bought a week's worth of rye now fetched only enough for a single meal. Debts ballooned. Land changed hands under duress. Desperation led to questionable choices. Some families sold their lands, their tools, even their children. In some towns, rumors began to swirl, of thefts from church stores, of grave robbing, of meat that was not from any known animal. Most of these stories were just that, stories. But they spread quickly in a world looking for answers. In the higher halls of power, royal courts and bishoprics began to respond, but slowly. Edicts were passed, attempting to regulate bread prices. Grain imports were ordered from distant provinces. But there was only so much that could be done when the rain would not stop and the fields would not yield. The famine was not a war to be won with soldiers or strategy. It was a slow bleed of society, made worse by the very systems meant to hold it together. People prayed harder. Processions marched barefoot through muddy streets. Relics were paraded from town to town. Sin, they believed, had brought this upon them. And perhaps that belief gave them comfort, for if the famine was punishment, then mercy might yet be found. But as bellies shrank and the rains persisted, even faith became heavy. By the time the true scale of the famine became undeniable, the early signs were long past. Those signs, the failed harvests, the first spikes in price, the whispers of unease, had been the quiet warnings of a storm no one knew how to stop. And had you lived then, even with a strong back and a willing heart, you would have been powerless to change it. The food was gone, the weather had turned, and the world no longer answered to the rhythms it once had. Starvation sets in, the physical and psychological toll. The slow, creeping hunger that gnawed at the bellies of medieval Europeans during the Great Famine was far more than mere emptiness. It was a profound assault on the body and mind, a relentless siege that transformed human flesh into a fragile shell and twisted hope into despair. To live through starvation was to endure a gradual unraveling of what made life possible: strength, clarity, dignity, replaced by weakness, confusion, and the rawest instincts for survival. At first, hunger might feel like an ache, a persistent gnawing that could be ignored or soothed with small morsels. But when the fields continued to fail, when grain grew scarce and prices soared beyond reach, that ache became a gnawing void, an emptiness that hollowed the belly and spread through the limbs. The body, starved of nutrients, began to betray its host. Muscles wasted away, the skin sagged and stretched thin over brittle bones, and the once bright eyes dulled under sunken sockets. The stomach, that restless organ, played cruel tricks. Without food, it would contract painfully, spasming in hunger pangs that could seize a person through the night. Yet paradoxically, the abdomen sometimes swelled and became distended, a grotesque sign of malnutrition known as kwashiorkor, caused by protein deficiency. This bloating was a visible mark of suffering, a silent cry that hunger had settled deep within the tissues, disrupting the balance of fluids and the body's ability to heal. The mind's torment and societal breakdown. Beyond the physical symptoms, starvation twisted the mind. As blood sugar levels dropped and the body's stores depleted, confusion and hallucinations could take hold. People reported seeing shadows that were not there, hearing voices in the silence, and feeling cold when warmth should have been a comfort. Fatigue became absolute. The simple act of rising from a bed of straw became monumental. Walking to the village well felt like a journey across a wasteland. Historical records from the time describe these horrors in grim detail. Chroniclers, monks, and local officials wrote of people wandering through towns begging for scraps, for rotten vegetables, for any form of sustenance. The desperation was so great that entire families would scour refuse heaps, risking disease and punishment for a chance to quell their hunger. Children were found lying listless in the streets, their bodies too weak even to cry. Mothers abandoned newborns, unable to care for them, while fathers, once strong and proud, collapsed beneath the weight of starvation's relentless grip. Skin lesions, sores, and boils appeared as the body's defenses falter. Without proper nutrition, wounds would not heal, and minor infections became deadly. The constant dampness of a cold, rainy famine year only worsened these conditions, turning sores into festering wounds. The stench of decay became a part of daily life, a harsh reminder that bodies weakened by hunger were vulnerable not just to starvation but to sickness and rot. Psychological impact and limited aid. Hunger bred not only physical frailty but also a psychological torment. The anxiety of uncertain food, the shame of begging, and the fear of death combined into a crushing burden. People described dreams where they ate, only to wake and find their mouths dry and empty. Sleep itself became elusive, replaced by nightmares and wakefulness filled with thoughts of food. Communities that had once relied on mutual aid sometimes fractured under the strain, suspicion growing that neighbors might steal what little was left. Medical knowledge of the time was limited. Starvation was seen as a punishment or a trial, and treatments were few and ineffective. Herbal remedies offered little relief, and the clergy provided spiritual solace but no cure. As bodies failed, diseases like typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections spread quickly through weakened populations. The hungry and the sick formed a deadly alliance, accelerating the toll of death and despair. Despite the bleakness, stories survive of remarkable endurance. Some families rationed what little they had with fierce discipline. Neighbors shared scarce food despite their own hunger. In villages where granaries remained stocked, local leaders sometimes distributed reserves to stave off total collapse. But these were the exceptions. For most, starvation was an inescapable fate, an invisible enemy that claimed the lives of millions. To imagine surviving even a single day in such conditions is to confront the rawest realities of human existence. It means facing a body that rebels against itself, a mind clouded by hunger and fear, and a world where every step might bring one closer to death. In those years, the Great Famine was not just a chapter in history. It was a brutal, lived experience that erased normal life and replaced it with the desperate struggle to endure. The urban crisis, cities under siege. As the Great Famine ravaged the countryside, its insidious effects crept relentlessly toward medieval cities, hubs of commerce, culture, and power, transforming them into epicenters of desperation and chaos. Cities like London, Paris, and Cologne, once bustling with the clatter of market stalls and the steady hum of daily trade, suddenly found themselves engulfed in a crisis that exposed the fragility of urban life in a world still tethered to the rhythms of the rural harvest. The marketplace falters. In these cities, the heartbeat of medieval economy, the marketplace, faltered first. The stalls that once overflowed with fresh bread, fruits, vegetables, salted meats, and barrels of ale began to empty. Farmers and traders, victims of failing crops and poor yields, could no longer supply the goods that sustained urban populations. The very air, once fragrant with the smell of baking bread and spices, grew thick with the stench of scarcity. Market vendors faced the grim reality that the coins jangled in their purses were worth less than the empty baskets they carried. Bakers, once modest but reliable purveyors of daily sustenance, found themselves overwhelmed. Long lines formed outside their shops as the price of bread soared beyond reach for many. The humble loaf, a staple of medieval diets, became a symbol of luxury and survival. When supplies of grain diminished, bakers were forced to stretch their meager stocks with inedible fillers like sawdust or ground tree bark, desperate measures that left their patrons sickened and further eroded trust. The desperate crowded the streets in growing numbers, their faces gaunt with hunger and eyes hollow with despair. Beggars, once tolerated as an unfortunate but manageable presence, multiplied alarmingly. They became a fixture on every corner, clustering near churches, markets, and city gates, their pleas for alms growing more urgent and heartrending with each passing day. The line between the starving and the destitute blurred. Many who had once labored in trades or crafts now found themselves reduced to scavenging for scraps. Scarcity, inflation, and fraying order. The urban poor, often dependent on food brought in from the surrounding countryside, faced a cruel paradox. Though closer to stores and granaries than their rural counterparts, the inflow of food was severely curtailed by the widespread crop failures beyond the city walls. This scarcity led to rampant inflation, a cruel twist of fate where food, when found, was priced beyond the reach of those most in need. In some quarters, the price of a single loaf of bread consumed more than a day's wages, forcing families to make impossible choices between feeding themselves or paying rent and taxes. City governments struggled under the mounting pressure, their limited authority tested by the scale of the crisis. Medieval urban administration was ill-equipped for disaster on this scale, hampered by fragmented jurisdictions and constrained by feudal allegiances. Efforts to regulate prices, restrict hoarding, and distribute emergency supplies were sporadic and often ineffective. Authorities sometimes resorted to harsh punishments against merchants accused of profiteering, but these measures could not create food where none existed. Public order frayed dangerously. Food riots erupted as mobs surged toward markets and granaries, smashing stalls and seizing whatever they could find. Guards and city officials faced the impossible task of containing unrest while managing dwindling resources. The thin line between survival and chaos grew thinner with every day. Fear and suspicion permeated the air, as neighbors eyed each other warily, and communities struggled to maintain social cohesion amid scarcity. The church, a cornerstone of medieval urban life, played a complex role during the crisis. Monasteries and parishes offered what charity they could, distributing bread, broth, and alms to the starving. Yet, even these sacred institutions were strained to their limits. The spiritual comfort they provided was often overshadowed by the grim reality that many would die despite their efforts. Furthermore, the church's insistence on tithes and obligations added layers of burden on the desperate urban poor, mirroring the tension seen in rural areas. Hospitals and infirmaries, rudimentary as they were, filled rapidly with those weakened by starvation and disease. Care was limited, largely palliative, and rarely effective against the infections that spread in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The sick and dying often languished in these institutions, their numbers swelling as the famine wore on. Psychological toll and migration. The psychological toll on urban populations was immense. The constant presence of death, the hunger gnawing at every stomach, and the daily struggle for survival created an atmosphere heavy with dread. Families who once planned futures together found themselves consumed by immediate fears of where the next meal would come from, whether their children would live through the night, or if they would be forced to abandon their homes. Yet amidst the despair, stories of resilience flickered. Neighbors shared what little they had. Guilds and fraternities pooled resources to assist the weakest, and city leaders sought to find solutions, however limited. Markets reopened sporadically, and some trade persisted, driven by necessity if not hope. These fragile moments of stability were vital, holding the social fabric together just long enough to prevent total collapse. As the famine wore on, migration surged. The urban crisis was not confined to those born within city walls. Desperate peasants flooded into towns and cities, hoping to escape rural starvation. But often, they found only the extension of the same hardship: crowded streets, scarce food, and increased competition for jobs and charity. The swelling numbers intensified the strain on already overburdened resources and services, heightening tensions between established city dwellers and newcomers. This influx added a volatile element to the urban mix, sometimes fueling xenophobia and scapegoating. Accusations flew about hoarders, witches, and even divine punishment. These fears would later ferment into darker episodes in European history, but during the famine, they underscored the deep fractures that scarcity inflicted on medieval urban society. Enduring scars. By the time relief finally came with a modest return to more normal weather and better harvests, the scars on these cities were profound. The population had been decimated, the economy crippled, and social order deeply shaken. Yet the cities endured, rebuilding from the ashes of hunger and loss, their experience a sobering lesson in the precariousness of medieval urban life. To walk the streets of a famine-stricken city was to witness humanity's raw struggle against overwhelming odds. It was a world where hunger turned neighbors into competitors, where the lines between charity and survival blurred, and where the smallest crumbs of hope were fought for fiercely. In those dark days, the city was both refuge and prison, a place of fragile survival perched precariously on the edge of collapse. Coping strategies: how people tried to survive. When the fields lay barren and the granaries emptied, the people of medieval Europe faced a stark choice: adapt or perish. The Great Famine pushed the limits of human endurance and ingenuity, forcing those caught in its merciless grip to embrace grim strategies for survival. These methods, desperate and often degrading, tell a haunting story of resilience, suffering, and the raw struggle to live one more day. Desperate dietary adaptations. As hunger gnawed relentlessly, familiar foodstuffs vanished from tables. The staple grains, rye, barley, and wheat, that had sustained generations were no longer available in sufficient quantities. With bread and porridge beyond reach, many turned to what the land still grudgingly offered. Trees, once a source of timber and shade, became a desperate pantry. People stripped bark from trees, grinding it into coarse flour to stretch the little grain they had left. The inner bark, or cambium, was scavenged and boiled to create a bitter, tasteless sustenance, but one that could fill a hollow stomach and delay the inevitable collapse. In fields and meadows, the green shoots of grass, once ignored or grazed upon by livestock, suddenly became a vital resource. Those desperate enough harvested blades of grass, dandelion leaves, and wild herbs, boiling or roasting them in crude attempts to extract nutrients. This meager fare, often tough and fibrous, was far from satisfying, but it served as a last line of defense against starvation. Leather, normally reserved for shoes, belts, and harnesses, became an unexpected food source in some of the hardest hit regions. Boiling hardened leather was a brutal, unpalatable necessity, yielding little nourishment but staving off death. Historical accounts reveal grim tales of families scraping the edges of their possessions to prolong life, each morsel a testimony to the extremes of human desperation. In a world where domestic animals were both companions and livelihoods, the line between food and friend blurred. Cats, traditionally viewed as hunters of vermin but also as household pets, were sometimes consumed. Dogs, horses, and even rodents might have been slaughtered in regions where nothing else remained. These actions, abhorrent to many, reflect the brutal calculus of survival during famine, where the instinct to live trumped cultural norms and attachments. Migration and societal breakdown. Some fled their villages altogether, abandoning homes, lands, and community ties in search of sustenance elsewhere. Forests, once places of fear and superstition, offered a precarious refuge. There, people foraged for wild berries, roots, and mushrooms, navigating unfamiliar and dangerous terrain. While the forests could provide some relief, they were also rife with hazards. Wild animals, exposure, and the threat of starvation still loomed large. The desperation of these wanderers underscores the profound dislocation wrought by the famine, as entire populations became nomadic in their search for food. But for many, the slow starvation bred darker responses. As hunger stripped away strength and reason, some turned to theft, stealing what little grain or livestock neighbors could hide. Villages and towns reported rising tensions, as suspicion and fear twisted relationships. What had once been communal support networks frayed under the weight of scarcity, replaced by suspicion and violence. Incidents of banditry, assaults, and even murder were recorded with increasing frequency, highlighting the breakdown of social order in the face of relentless hunger. Chroniclers of the period, writing with a mixture of horror and fascination, documented rumors and accusations of cannibalism. Whether these stories reflected actual events or were the product of fear, superstition, and the scapegoating of the desperate is debated among historians. Yet, their very presence in records reveals the extreme psychological toll of the famine. The fact that such rumors took hold indicates a society pushed to the brink, a world where the boundaries of acceptable behavior dissolved beneath the shadow of death. Resilience and enduring hope. Amid these grim survival tactics, acts of quiet heroism and self-sacrifice also emerged. Families shared scraps with the weakest members, children, the elderly, and the sick, even when their own stomachs cried out in protest. Communities sometimes banded together to protect vulnerable neighbors from theft or violence, seeking to preserve some semblance of humanity amid hardship. The church, too, maintained its role as a beacon of charity and hope, despite the strain on its resources. Monasteries and parishes distributed food and alms to the needy, often at great cost to their own sustainability. These efforts, though limited, provided crucial lifelines for many who might otherwise have succumbed. Throughout the famine, the relentless hunger exacted a profound psychological toll. Survivors recounted feelings of despair, hopelessness, and a pervasive fear of death. The body's physical deterioration mirrored the mind's unraveling, as starvation eroded not only flesh but the very will to endure. Yet, despite these horrors, many clung tenaciously to life, driven by hope, faith, or sheer instinct. In sum, the coping strategies during the Great Famine paint a stark portrait of human resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. From eating tree bark and boiled leather to fleeing into forests and succumbing to theft or violence, these desperate measures reveal both the depth of suffering and the indomitable spirit to survive. They remind us that beneath the grand sweep of history lie countless individual stories of struggle, sacrifice, and survival, stories that together define the human experience in its darkest hours. The role of the Church: charity, prayer, and politics. When famine darkened the fields and empty bellies echoed across medieval Europe, the Church stood at the heart of society's response. As the world's largest landowner and the spiritual beacon for millions, the Church's role was complex and multifaceted. It was a source of hope, charity, and spiritual guidance, but also a political power grappling with its own limitations in the face of mass suffering. The famine was widely seen through a religious lens. In a deeply devout era, natural disasters were rarely explained by science or climate but interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. The relentless rains and failing crops were thought to be God's punishment for the sins of humanity. Sermons preached by parish priests and monks echoed with calls for repentance, urging people to fast, confess, and seek forgiveness. Processions wound through towns and villages, a visible display of collective penance meant to appease the heavens. These rituals, solemn and fraught with desperation, carried both spiritual and social weight, offering a fragile thread of hope in a world unraveling. Monastic aid and overwhelmed institutions. Monasteries, often seen as bastions of stability and charity, became focal points for relief efforts. Though these religious communities lived apart from the general population, they were not immune to famine's reach. Their own crops failed, their granaries emptied, and their livestock perished. Yet, despite their own hardships, monasteries opened their doors to the starving, distributing what little food they could spare. These acts of charity were profound sacrifices, emblematic of the Church's commitment to care for the poor and suffering. The Church also administered hospitals and almshouses, rudimentary institutions that became overwhelmed by the flood of hungry, sick, and dying. Monks and nuns tended to the ill with a mix of prayer and practical care, though medical knowledge was limited. Many who sought refuge found only temporary relief before disease and exhaustion claimed their lives. These places, steeped in faith, were both sanctuaries and grim reminders of the famine's merciless toll. Economic power and moral dilemmas. At the same time, the Church's position was complicated by its role as a major landowner and tax collector. Like the secular lords, it relied on tithes, a tenth of agricultural produce, from peasants. These obligations persisted even as hunger deepened. For many peasants, the Church was both a spiritual refuge and a source of economic burden. Tensions occasionally flared when clergy demanded payments from families struggling to survive, highlighting the fragile balance between charity and authority. Church leaders themselves faced difficult decisions, caught between the spiritual duty to care and the political realities of maintaining their estates and influence. Bishops and abbots negotiated with secular lords, sometimes coordinating relief efforts, but often striving to protect their own resources. The famine exposed cracks within the church hierarchy, revealing that its capacity to respond was limited by competing interests and widespread scarcity. Spiritual sustenance and enduring legacy. Prayer was central to the church's response. The belief that divine intervention could turn the tide sustained many through the darkest days. Masses were held with heightened fervor, relics paraded through towns, and vows made in hopes of mercy. The church's rituals offered structure and meaning, providing solace when food could not. Yet, when rains continued and death spread, faith itself was tested. Questions of why God allowed such suffering haunted sermons and the hearts of believers alike. The famine also had lasting impacts on the church's relationship with the populace. In some regions, the inability to alleviate suffering eroded trust and faith, sowing seeds of doubt that would later grow into calls for reform. At the same time, stories of miraculous survival and charitable deeds reinforced the church's spiritual authority and social role. In essence, the church during the Great Famine was a beacon of light flickering in a storm, offering charity, hope, and ritual, but constrained by its own vulnerabilities and the relentless hunger gripping the land. Its response shaped not only how people survived the crisis but how medieval society understood suffering, divine will, and community responsibility. In medieval Europe, the church was more than a place of worship. It was the heartbeat of daily life, the mediator between earthly hardship and heavenly salvation. When the Great Famine swept across the continent, its devastating grip was not just a physical ordeal but a profound spiritual crisis. The church was expected to provide answers, comfort, and aid. Yet, the reality it faced was far more complicated, a mixture of hope, limitation, political power, and moral struggle. As crops failed and food supplies dwindled, medieval people looked upwards for meaning. The pervasive belief was that God controlled the natural world and that disasters like famine were a form of divine punishment. This theological interpretation shaped the church's response profoundly. Preachers and priests delivered solemn sermons, urging their congregations to repentance, confession, and fasting. The idea was simple yet terrifying. Only through collective humility and atonement could God's wrath be softened. In towns and villages, processions became common scenes of desperation and devotion. People walked barefoot, carrying crosses and religious icons, their faces marked by fear and hope. These communal acts of penance were designed to unite the community in sorrow and petition. Such rituals reinforced social cohesion but also revealed the limits of human control over fate. For many, this was all they could do: pray and wait. Monasteries and convents, often viewed as sanctuaries of learning and charity, played a pivotal role during the famine. Their large estates and well-stocked granaries were critical in times of plenty, but when the famine took hold, these resources rapidly depleted. Even within these walls, hunger gnawed at monks and nuns. Still, many of these religious communities chose to share what little they had with the starving. Feeding the poor was seen as a sacred duty, a living embodiment of Christ's teachings. Bread was broken and portions shared, often at great sacrifice to the monastic community itself. Hospitals affiliated with the church became overwhelmed. These early institutions offered rudimentary care to the sick and hungry, places where faith and medicine intertwined. Nuns and monks tended wounds, soothed fevers, and offered prayers for recovery. But with starvation weakening bodies and the spread of disease rampant, many patients found no relief from the grip of death. Records from monastery infirmaries reveal the grim reality: beds overflowing, care stretched thin, and clergy struggling to provide comfort to the dying. Yet, the church was not only a source of compassion but also an enormous landowner and economic force. It collected tithes from peasants, a mandatory tenth of their produce, even in times of famine. This system meant that the church's coffers continued to fill while many of its flocks starved. The obligation to pay tithes in the midst of widespread hunger created tension and resentment. For starving peasants, giving up a portion of their meager harvest was a cruel imposition, and in some places, this led to open conflict. The church's dual role as spiritual guide and landlord created a delicate balance. Bishops and abbots held significant political influence, negotiating with kings and nobles, administering estates, and managing resources. In times of crisis, These leaders faced difficult decisions: how to allocate scarce food supplies, whether to ease the burden of tithes, and how to maintain the institution's stability. Their choices could mean the difference between life and death for entire communities. Beyond material aid, the church sought to provide spiritual sustenance. Masses were intensified, prayers multiplied, and relics venerated with renewed fervor. The belief in miracles was widespread, and stories of divine intervention spread quickly. People clung to the hope that saints could intercede, that relics held healing power, and that God's mercy was within reach. This spiritual framework was both a source of comfort and, paradoxically, a source of frustration when the famine dragged on. The famine tested faith on a personal level as well. As hunger sapped strength and hope, many individuals wrestled with doubt and despair. The question, "Why would a merciful God allow such suffering?" echoed in countless hearts. Some found solace in deeper devotion, others in fatalism, and still others in anger toward religious authorities who seemed powerless. These spiritual struggles were woven into the daily experience of starvation and death. The church's response was not uniform across Europe. Some monasteries and churches became centers of charity, distributing grain and offering shelter, while others struggled to maintain even their own survival. In some regions, clergy organized relief efforts, working alongside secular leaders to provide food and aid. In others, the scarcity and fear led to hoarding, corruption, and neglect. The crisis exposed the strengths and weaknesses of an institution that was as human and fallible as the society it served. Moreover, the famine precipitated changes in the church's social role. It highlighted the need for more organized charity and set precedents for future social welfare. The relief efforts, however limited, planted the seeds for a gradual evolution in how the church engaged with the poor and needy. The memory of the famine's horrors lingered in sermons and chronicles, shaping the religious and cultural consciousness for generations. In this way, the church was both a beacon and a mirror, illuminating hope in dark times and reflecting the complex interplay of faith, power, and human suffering. For those caught in the Great Famine, the church's presence was a lifeline, a source of comfort, and sometimes a source of conflict. To live through that time was to navigate a world where hunger was a physical reality and faith was the fragile thread holding existence together. Government and nobility responses, ineffective or brutal? In the shadow of famine, when the land itself seemed to turn against its people, the burden of response fell heavily upon the shoulders of rulers and nobles, kings, queens, lords, and local magistrates whose power and authority defined medieval society. Yet, their efforts to confront the catastrophe often revealed the limitations of medieval governance and the brutal realities of powers struggling to maintain order amid desperation. Ineffective price controls and limited reserves. As the famine deepened, royal courts issued proclamations aimed at controlling the escalating crisis. The most common of these were decrees to freeze the prices of staple foods, especially grain, and to forbid the export of supplies outside their domains. The intention was clear: keep food within the realm, prevent profiteering, and ensure that common folk could at least access the bare essentials. On paper, these measures appeared reasonable. If everyone's access to bread and grain could be safeguarded, the worst might be averted. However, the enforcement of such decrees was an entirely different matter. The medieval state was fragmented and limited in its reach, relying heavily on local lords and officials who often had their own interests. Royal edicts traveled slowly, their impact diluted by the challenges of communication and administration. In many cases, local authorities either lacked the means or the will to enforce price controls effectively. Market forces, already strained by scarcity, pushed prices higher, creating a grim cycle of inflation that made food unattainable for many. Some rulers attempted to establish royal granaries, stockpiling grain to stabilize markets or provide emergency relief. Yet, these reserves were often insufficient to meet the scale of demand. The logistics of storage and distribution posed immense challenges. Grain spoils without careful management, and the infrastructure to move large quantities across vast and often war-torn territories was rudimentary at best. As a result, many royal granaries failed to deliver the salvation they promised, leaving peasants to face hunger alone. Hoarding, repression, and social division. Moreover, the economic motivations of the nobility complicated these efforts. Lords, who owned vast tracts of land and controlled local food supplies, had vested interests in preserving their wealth and status. In times of crisis, some resorted to hoarding grain to drive up prices or to secure their own survival first. Such hoarding could mean the difference between life and death for neighboring peasants who depended on the local markets or customary rights to glean leftover crops. When starvation drove crowds to the edge of revolt, some nobles responded with harsh measures. Soldiers and armed retainers were deployed to quell food riots and protect storehouses. The sight of hungry mobs converging on market stalls or granaries was a constant threat to the fragile order. These confrontations often turned violent, as desperation clashed with authority. Chroniclers of the time record instances of guards opening fire on peasants or arresting those accused of theft, illustrating a grim calculus. Social stability was sometimes prioritized over mercy. The nature of medieval justice compounded the harshness. Theft of food, even by the starving, was considered a severe crime. Punishments ranged from public flogging to execution, sending a brutal message to others who might challenge the established order. For the desperate, the choice was stark: risk death for stealing bread or face starvation. Such a predicament reveals the cold reality of power during famine. Survival was not a right but a precarious bargain within a system designed to protect privilege. In addition to suppressing unrest, rulers tried other strategies. Some attempted to negotiate with neighboring realms to import food, though political rivalries and logistical hurdles often thwarted these efforts. Others mandated communal labor or public works in exchange for relief, weaving a complex relationship between charity and control. The idea was to maintain productivity and prevent idleness, even amid the catastrophe. Limits of power and enduring hardship. Yet, these measures also exposed the gap between intention and reality. Public works projects required physical strength and nourishment that many starving peasants lacked. Failure to meet these demands could lead to punishment or exclusion from relief programs, further marginalizing the most vulnerable. In this way, the famine magnified existing social inequalities, reinforcing a hierarchy where the suffering of the many was often subordinated to the interests of the few. The nobility's responses were also entangled with the broader political context. Many regions were still recovering from wars, internal conflicts, or disputes over succession. The famine exacerbated tensions between rival factions, as control over scarce resources became a critical factor in power struggles. Some lords exploited the crisis to strengthen their local dominance, wielding food as a tool of political leverage. This made the plight of the starving not only a humanitarian crisis but also a theater of shifting alliances and conflicts. Meanwhile, royal authority itself was tested. Kings and queens were expected to embody divine justice and protectors of their people, yet many found themselves powerless or compromised. Their courts were often filled with nobles more concerned with self-interest than public welfare. As famine persisted, the legitimacy of rulers was questioned, and discontent simmered beneath the surface. The inability to alleviate suffering undermined faith in leadership, sowing seeds of unrest that would bear fruit in later social upheavals. Despite these failures, there were occasional moments of compassion and effective intervention. Some rulers enacted temporary tax relief or distributed charity from their own coffers. Certain local lords opened their granaries to feed peasants or reduced rents. These acts, though exceptions rather than the rule, reveal a complex mosaic of responses driven by a mix of duty, fear, and genuine care. In the end, the responses of governments and nobility during the Great European Famine were a mirror of medieval society itself, fragmented, hierarchical, and struggling to adapt to a catastrophe beyond its control. The laws and decrees, while well-meaning, often fell short against the brutal realities of scarcity and desperation. Power was wielded unevenly, sometimes brutally, as the elite sought to maintain order and privilege in a world unraveling at the edges. For the ordinary person, caught in this maelstrom, survival depended less on royal proclamations and more on personal resilience, community networks, and sheer luck. The state's promises were often empty, and the sword of justice could be as threatening as the hunger that gnawed at their bellies. To live through the Great Famine was to navigate a world where those in power tried to hold the pieces together, sometimes by kindness, often by force, but rarely with the speed or compassion that starvation demanded. The famine and social unrest, riots and revolts. As hunger tightened its relentless grip across the land, it was not just stomachs that grew empty but the very fabric of medieval society that began to fray. The Great European Famine did more than starve bodies. it unsettled minds, stirred despair, and sowed seeds of unrest that would ignite sporadic flames of rebellion across the countryside. When the basics of survival slipped beyond reach, the order that once held communities together began to unravel, exposing the volatile and fragile nature of a world built on scarcity and hierarchy. Eruptions of desperation in villages. In villages scattered across the continent, the desperation born of hunger erupted into violent confrontations. The sight of empty granaries, once a symbol of provision and security, became unbearable provocations. These storehouses of grain, hoarded by local lords or controlled by church authorities, represented life itself. When peasants saw these supplies locked away while their children cried for food, fury was inevitable. Crowds, often led by the most desperate among them, surged toward granaries in the dead of night, smashing doors, overturning barrels, and seizing whatever could be carried away. These were not acts of theft born of greed, but primal struggles for survival in a world turned cruelly against them. Millers, those entrusted with grinding the grain into flour, became tragic figures in this unfolding drama. Their mills, the heartbeat of local food production, were the last stop before grain transformed into bread, the staple of medieval diets. When famine struck, suspicion fell heavily on them. Were they hoarding flour? Were they selling it to the highest bidder? The lines between fact and rumor blurred, and some millers paid the ultimate price. There are accounts of violent attacks, where peasants, driven by hunger and fear, murdered millers, tearing apart both the people and the institutions they symbolized. The mills themselves were sometimes sabotaged or burned, acts that further disrupted an already fragile food supply. The unrest was not limited to small-scale violence or sporadic theft. In some regions, particularly where famine's toll was harshest and governance weakest, entire villages rose in revolt. These were communities pushed to the brink, where hunger was compounded by years of heavy taxation, feudal oppression, and political neglect. The revolts were chaotic and desperate, often lacking centralized leadership but unified by a shared cry against a system that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Suppression and fractured society. Yet, the ability to rebel was itself unevenly distributed. Starvation drained the strength of many before they could even consider resistance. Bodies weakened by lack of nourishment grew frail and vulnerable. The sick and elderly, most susceptible to disease and exhaustion, could do little more than endure quietly. In many cases, the weight of survival overshadowed any impulse to fight. The idea of revolt, while simmering in anger and whispered conversations, often remained a distant hope, crushed by the harsh reality of physical weakness. Despite these limitations, where rebellion did break out, it was met with swift and brutal suppression. Lords and their retainers, aware that the very foundations of their power were at risk, responded with force. Armed militias were dispatched to quell uprisings, often with ruthless efficiency. Chroniclers recount scenes of villages burned, leaders executed, and punitive measures imposed to deter future unrest. Such reprisals underscored the stark imbalance between those who wielded authority and those who suffered beneath it. The riots and revolts were symptoms of a deeper fracture between the governed and the governors, between the starving masses and the land-holding elite. They revealed how famine was not merely a natural disaster but a catalyst that exposed social tensions long suppressed by tradition and hierarchy. The feudal system, with its rigid structures and obligations, began to crack as survival took precedence over loyalty or obedience. Moreover, the violence of these moments left scars that outlasted the famine itself. Distrust between peasants and landlords deepened, communities were fractured, and social cohesion weakened. The memory of bloodshed and betrayal lingered, shaping attitudes and power dynamics for generations. In some regions, the trauma of famine-era unrest contributed to later movements for social change, fueling the gradual erosion of feudal order. Complexities and lingering lessons. Yet, amid the chaos and brutality, there were also stories of reluctant solidarity. Some local leaders, recognizing the limits of force, sought to negotiate or provide limited relief to pacify their communities. These acts were rare and often constrained by resources, but they reflect a complex interplay of fear, pragmatism, and humanity within the crisis. The famine forced everyone, peasants, nobles, and clergy alike, to confront the fragility of their world and the precarious balance of power. In reflecting on these turbulent times, it becomes clear that famine did not just take lives, it unsettled minds and shattered the social contract. The riots and revolts that punctuated the Great European Famine were desperate expressions of a people pushed beyond endurance. They remind us that hunger is not only a physical affliction but a force that can reshape societies, challenge authority, and reveal the profound vulnerability of human communities when the basic needs of life are threatened. The psychological landscape: fear, despair, and hope. The famine did not merely ravage the body, it plunged the human spirit into a tempest of fear and despair, yet beneath the darkness, a fragile glimmer of hope endured. The psychological landscape of the time was shaped by a profound sense of uncertainty, where the line between natural calamity and divine punishment blurred. Many believed that the very end of days was unfolding before their eyes, that the apocalypse had begun to unravel the world as they knew it. Across towns and villages, chronicles and personal diaries, rare but precious windows into the inner lives of the medieval people, reveal how deeply this conviction penetrated daily existence. People grappled not only with hunger but with the weight of existential dread. The heavens, once a source of comfort and order, seemed ominous and silent. Starvation was not only a physical torment but a spiritual trial, a test of faith amid relentless suffering. Faith, fear, and ritual. Amid these harrowing times, the language of fear echoed in sermons preached from stone pulpits and in whispered prayers uttered in candlelit chambers. The church played a central role in shaping this mental landscape. Clergy urged their congregations to repent, to seek forgiveness for sins that they believed had brought this calamity upon them. Processions wound through muddy streets, crosses held high, and cries of penitence filled the air. Fasting and prayer became acts of desperate hope, rituals designed to appeal to divine mercy in a world turned cold and barren. Yet, despair was never absolute. Even in the darkest hours, the human spirit found ways to endure and resist surrender. Diaries, where they survive, capture moments of trembling faith, of individuals clinging to the belief that salvation was possible. These writings tell of miraculous visions, of small blessings that renewed courage, and of communal acts of charity that affirmed bonds between neighbors even when food was scarce. Helplessness, suspicion, and resilience. The famine also intensified the psychological burden of helplessness. Families watched children wither away, husbands mourned wives lost to starvation, and entire communities faced the agonizing question of who would survive. The unpredictability of fate bred suspicion and anxiety. Trust frayed as neighbors sometimes resorted to hoarding or turning on each other, while others sought solace in shared suffering. This interplay of fear and solidarity reveals the complexity of human response to prolonged crisis. Amid this turbulence, stories circulated of saints and miracles, stories that offered hope and meaning in a seemingly senseless tragedy. Monasteries, often centers of learning and faith, became refuges not only for bodies but for spirits. The monks recorded not only the grim statistics of death but also accounts of resilience and divine intervention. These records suggest that for many, faith was both a shield against despair and a compass pointing toward an uncertain future. At the same time, skepticism and despair coexisted uneasily. Some voices, though muted and scarce, expressed doubt, questioning the justice of a God who would allow such suffering. This silent despair, buried beneath public expressions of faith, underscores the psychological toll that famine exacted on individuals and communities alike. A complex tapestry of human experience. The mental landscape shaped by the Great European Famine was thus a complex tapestry woven from fear, despair, hope, and faith. It was a time when the boundaries between the physical and spiritual blurred, and survival meant enduring not only hunger but the deep shadows cast upon the human soul. This psychological terrain reminds us that historical catastrophes are not only about what happens to bodies and lands, but also about how people find meaning, maintain hope, and struggle to keep their humanity intact in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Great Famine was not only a catastrophe of the body, it was a relentless assault on the human psyche. As the harvests failed and the once familiar rhythms of life were shattered, an overwhelming sense of dread settled over the people of medieval Europe. The psychological landscape was steeped in fear, despair, and a profound uncertainty about the future. But amid this darkness, faint threads of hope, faith, and resilience wove their way into daily existence, sustaining fragile human spirits struggling to endure. Medieval people lived in a world deeply intertwined with religion. The heavens above were not merely distant stars but signs and messages from the divine. When the rains failed or flooded the fields, it was interpreted as a signal, perhaps a punishment for sin or a warning of impending apocalypse. The famine, in this sense, was a cosmic event, an unraveling of the natural order ordained by God. This belief intensified the psychological torment. The crisis was not just about hunger, but the fear of eternal damnation or divine wrath. Many clergymen preached fire and brimstone sermons in darkened churches, urging their congregations to repent. These sermons were both a balm and a burden. They offered a pathway to salvation but also laid blame on the people for their suffering. Processions filled the streets, crosses and icons held high, as communities sought to appeal to God's mercy. The repetitive chanting of prayers, the solemn rituals of fasting, and public displays of penance became acts of desperation in the face of an indifferent and punishing sky. The weight of loss and seeds of resilience. The psychological weight of the famine was compounded by the relentless toll on families and communities. Parents watched helplessly as children's faces grew gaunt, their energy sapped by hunger and disease. Husbands and wives mourned the loss of loved ones, often in silence or with a stoic acceptance born from exhaustion. The daily fear of who would be next to succumb was a constant shadow. This pervasive anxiety left little room for hope, as the future became an uncharted void where survival seemed increasingly unlikely. Personal writings, though rare, provide glimpses into the mental anguish of the time. Diaries and annals, often kept by monks or literate nobles, occasionally reveal moments of intimate despair and trembling faith. In one such account, a monk records the sorrow of a village succumbing to starvation, describing how the once bustling hamlet fell silent except for the coughs of the dying and the weeping of the desperate. Yet even here, amid the darkest hours, there are mentions of small miracles, unexpected kindnesses, a sudden rainstorm, or a moment of communal prayer that lifted spirits, however briefly. Fear bred suspicion, further fracturing communities. When every handful of grain was precious, trust among neighbors became strained. Hoarding food, once a sign of prudence, could be seen as betrayal. Rumors of witchcraft or divine punishment spread, feeding paranoia. In some places, accusations arose that certain individuals had cursed the land or hoarded grain to profit from the misery of others. This climate of fear and mistrust added a psychological torment that cut as deeply as hunger. Yet alongside fear and despair, human resilience shone through. Stories passed down through generations tell of neighbors sharing scraps, strangers offering shelter, and communities banding together in mutual aid. The famine forced people to confront the limits of their endurance, but it also revealed the strength of social bonds. In many villages, despite the scarcity, acts of generosity and care became lifelines for the vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the sick. Faith, doubt, and enduring humanity. Religious faith was both a refuge and a source of psychological conflict. For many, prayer was a way to cope, to find meaning in suffering. Pilgrimages increased, with the desperate traveling to shrines and relics in hopes of divine intervention. Monasteries, often better stocked and organized, became centers not only of charity but also of spiritual support. Yet these very institutions were not immune to the crisis, and as they struggled to feed themselves, the limits of earthly salvation became painfully apparent. The belief that the famine was a form of divine punishment also inspired reflections on justice and morality. Some saw the suffering as a call to repentance and renewal, while others questioned the fairness of a God who allowed innocent children and the poor to starve. This tension between faith and doubt created deep psychological strain, visible in the writings and oral traditions of the time. It is here that we glimpse the raw humanity beneath medieval piety, fear of death mingling with a yearning for hope. The famine's psychological impact extended beyond individuals to shape the collective mindset of an era. The sense of living through an apocalypse influenced art, literature, and folklore. Dark imagery of death, decay, and judgment became common themes, reflecting the pervasive anxiety. Yet even in this bleak cultural landscape, there were flickers of hope, visions of renewal, rebirth, and eventual recovery that would come with the return of good harvests and kinder seasons. In sum, the psychological terrain of the Great Famine was complex and multifaceted. It was marked by fear of starvation and death, despair at the seeming abandonment by God, and the crushing weight of social breakdown. But it was also a landscape where faith, hope, and human kindness endured, where people found ways, however small and fragile, to maintain their dignity and spirit in the face of relentless hardship. To understand why you wouldn't last a day in the Great European Famine is to grasp not only the physical deprivation but the mental and emotional struggle that defined this dark chapter in history. Survival demanded not just nourishment but extraordinary resilience to withstand the psychological storms that left scars on individuals and societies long after the famine's end. Regional differences. How some areas fared better or worse. The Great Famine stretched across the breadth of medieval Europe, but its impact was far from uniform. The suffering varied widely from region to region, shaped by geography, politics, local leadership, and the resilience of communities. To truly grasp why survival was so precarious, and why you wouldn't last a day in the Great European Famine, it is essential to explore how different areas coped, endured, or crumbled under the weight of hunger and hardship. Comparing England, France, the Low Countries, and Germany reveals a complex tapestry of resilience and vulnerability, revealing the fragile interplay between environment, society, and leadership in a time of crisis. England's experience: climate, politics, and church influence. England's experience of the famine was marked by a landscape both blessed and cursed. Its temperate climate and fertile soils had long supported a growing population, but the climatic shifts and relentless rains that devastated harvests during the famine hit its agricultural heartlands hard. The low-lying eastern regions, with their rich arable fields, suffered particularly badly as waterlogged soils drowned crops and stunted growth. However, England's insular position offered some natural protection against the spread of disease that would follow the famine in later decades. Yet even this was cold comfort as market towns like Norwich and York saw bread prices skyrocket and common people pushed to the brink. Political turmoil compounded England's difficulties. The feudal lords, deeply entrenched in their local power, struggled to maintain order amid rising desperation. Some attempted to enforce price controls or ration grain, but enforcement was patchy and often met with resentment. The church, a dominant landowner, tried to provide charity, but monasteries themselves suffered shortages and were forced to ration aid. These local variations in leadership meant that some English villages managed to survive by pooling resources or relying on abbey stocks, while others fell into starvation and despair. France's fragmentation and diverse responses. France, sprawling and diverse in its terrain, presented a more complicated picture. The famine's reach extended into the heart of the kingdom, affecting both the rich agricultural plains of the Ile-de-France and the more marginal lands of Brittany and the Auvergne. Here, the problem was often one of scale and governance. The French monarchy, still consolidating power, found it difficult to coordinate effective relief across such a vast territory. Regional nobles held sway, and their priorities sometimes diverged sharply from those of the crown or the church. The political fragmentation of France meant that local responses varied dramatically. In some areas, abbeys and monasteries had anticipated hard times, stockpiling grain and livestock. These religious centers became crucial bastions of survival, distributing food to peasants and sheltering the weak. The Abbey of Cluny, for instance, had amassed significant reserves and was able to offer sustenance to thousands during the worst years. However, not all regions were so fortunate. In parts of northern France, where fields lay fallow or flooded, and the harvest failed repeatedly, starvation was widespread. Here, rural communities were left to fend for themselves, often with little to no support. The Low Countries, water's double-edged sword. The Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, stood out for their complex network of waterways and fertile plains. These lands had long relied on sophisticated drainage and irrigation systems to reclaim marshes and improve agricultural output. Yet, during the famine, the rising waters that had once nurtured crops turned into an enemy, flooding fields and destroying seed stores. Political fragmentation in the region made a coordinated response difficult. City-states like Bruges and Ghent, wealthy from trade and textile production, had some means to import food or ration supplies, but their rural hinterlands were far more vulnerable. Local governance varied widely across the Low Countries. Some city councils and guilds took active roles in managing grain supplies, enforcing price controls, and organizing charitable relief. In other areas, nobles and abbots hoarded resources or were slow to act, exacerbating suffering. The dense population and close proximity of towns led to rapid spread of disease as starvation weakened immune systems. Yet, there were remarkable stories of community resilience. Fishing villages and peat harvesters sometimes fared better because their livelihoods depended less directly on grain harvests. Germany's patchwork of principalities. Germany's experience was perhaps the most fragmented and varied, reflecting its patchwork of principalities, bishoprics, and free cities. The terrain ranged from fertile river valleys to dense forests and mountainous regions, influencing both agricultural productivity and the severity of famine. The fragmented political landscape meant that some regions had strong, organized relief efforts, while others descended into chaos and starvation. The wealthy ecclesiastical principalities, where powerful bishops controlled land and resources, sometimes proved better prepared. Monasteries in regions like Bavaria and the Rhineland held food stores and coordinated aid. However, many rural peasants were at the mercy of local lords whose priorities ranged from benevolent stewardship to ruthless exploitation. In parts of eastern Germany, the famine was compounded by political instability and ongoing conflicts that disrupted trade and movement, making survival even more precarious. The German cities, including Cologne and Nuremberg, faced their own crises. Urban populations swelled as rural people fled hunger, overwhelming markets and stretching charitable institutions thin. Yet the dense networks of trade in the Holy Roman Empire sometimes allowed these cities to import grain from less affected regions, mitigating the worst effects. Still, these supplies were expensive and often beyond the reach of the poorest. The critical role of monasteries and varied outcomes. Throughout all these regions, the role of abbeys and monasteries as food reservoirs was critical. Their ability to stockpile grain, preserve livestock, and distribute aid saved countless lives. Many monasteries had developed systems over centuries to manage surpluses and support surrounding communities in times of scarcity. Yet even these institutions were strained to breaking points during the famine, sometimes facing their own shortages and moral dilemmas about whom to feed when resources were scarce. The contrast between regions highlights a fundamental truth. Survival in the Great Famine was shaped by a delicate balance of geography, governance, social cohesion, and sheer luck. Some areas benefited from fertile lands, effective local leadership, and religious institutions willing and able to share resources. Others faced the compounded misfortune of poor harvests, fragmented authority, and communities isolated by politics or terrain. Understanding these regional differences deepens our appreciation of how complex and fragile medieval society was in the face of natural disaster. It was not just a question of food on the table but of political will, social structures, and environmental realities all converging to determine life or death. To live through the famine, or to fail to survive even a day, depended as much on where one was born as on one's own strength or will. In this mosaic of suffering and survival, we glimpse the harsh reality of medieval Europe's vulnerability. The Great Famine was not a single, uniform event but a patchwork of crises, woven together by climate, politics, and human responses. It revealed the fault lines of a society struggling to sustain itself amid changing times and relentless hardship. And it left scars, on land, on people, and on the very fabric of European civilization, that would echo for generations. The famine's legacy: changes in society and agriculture. The Great European Famine was more than a fleeting catastrophe. It was a turning point that reshaped medieval society and agriculture in profound and lasting ways. The deep scars left by those harrowing years endured long after the harvests finally recovered, and the echoes of hunger changed the course of history. To understand why you wouldn't last a day in that time is to grasp not only the immediate suffering but also the transformation that famine forced upon the social fabric, the economy, and the very way people lived and worked. Demographic collapse and shifting power dynamics. One of the most visible and tragic legacies of the famine was the staggering decline in population. The millions who perished left a void in villages and towns across Europe, a silence where once vibrant communities had thrived. Entire hamlets disappeared, fields lay fallow, and markets emptied. This demographic collapse disrupted centuries-old social orders. Peasant families were shattered, many children never reached adulthood, and those who survived bore the physical and psychological marks of near starvation. The death toll was so immense that it would take generations for populations to rebound to pre-famine levels. Yet this catastrophic loss of life had paradoxical consequences. With fewer mouths to feed, the pressure on the land lessened. Marginal fields once cultivated out of desperation were abandoned, allowing soils to recover and fertility to improve. Land that had been overworked now had a chance to rest, setting the stage for agricultural innovation in the coming decades. This demographic shift was a painful reset, but it also loosened the strict ties that had bound peasants to their lords under feudalism. Indeed, the famine exposed and accelerated the weakening of the feudal system, a rigid social and economic order that had governed medieval life for centuries. With so many laborers dead or weakened, the balance of power between lords and peasants began to shift subtly but irrevocably. Surviving peasants found themselves in higher demand, and their labor could no longer be taken for granted. This increased bargaining power allowed some to negotiate better terms, whether reduced rents, fewer days of forced labor, or greater freedom to move. These small but significant changes sowed the seeds of social upheaval that would erupt in later revolts and peasant uprisings. Dietary shifts and agricultural innovation. The famine also changed diets in ways that reveal much about resilience and adaptation. Grain shortages forced medieval people to seek alternative sources of nutrition. For many, this meant turning to a diet heavier in meat and dairy products, where available, because livestock, though also affected, were sometimes less vulnerable to crop failures than fields of rye or wheat. In some regions, the famine led to greater reliance on hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. This shift, though born of necessity, began to alter eating habits and food culture slowly, influencing the medieval palate and agricultural priorities for generations to come. Agriculture itself evolved in response to the harsh lessons of the famine. The traditional three-field system, which rotated crops and left one field fallow each year, was strained by population pressures and climatic instability. After the famine, there was a gradual push toward more efficient and resilient farming techniques. Farmers experimented with new crops that could better withstand poor weather, such as legumes, which improved soil fertility by fixing nitrogen, and hardier cereal varieties. Some areas saw increased use of manure and other natural fertilizers to boost yields, while others embraced improved plows and harnessing techniques that allowed for deeper tillage and better use of oxen or horses. At the same time, the famine exposed the vulnerabilities of a monoculture reliant heavily on a few staple crops. The heavy dependence on rye, barley, and wheat meant that when the rains failed or flooded the fields, entire harvests were lost. This stark reality forced a broader awareness of agricultural risk and the need for diversification. Though change was slow and uneven, these early adaptations laid groundwork that would, centuries later, lead to more sustainable farming systems in Europe. Social fractures and enduring legacy. The famine's aftermath also marked a subtle transformation in rural communities and social relations. The shared experience of hardship created new forms of mutual aid and cooperation, even as fear and mistrust lingered. Village assemblies and local guilds, where they existed, sometimes gained influence by organizing relief or negotiating with lords on behalf of starving peasants. These grassroots forms of community resilience, forged in crisis, would become important in later social and political developments, including the gradual erosion of feudal obligations and the rise of more autonomous rural societies. Yet the legacy of famine was not solely about adaptation and resilience. It was also a period of deep social fracture. The desperation caused by hunger and death bred resentment toward nobles and clergy, especially where these elites were seen as hoarding resources or failing to provide adequate relief. This resentment simmered beneath the surface, contributing to social tensions that would explode in uprisings during the later medieval period. The famine highlighted the fragility and inequity of the feudal order, exposing a system unable to protect or feed its most vulnerable. The Church, which had played a central role during the famine years in providing charity and interpreting the disaster through a spiritual lens, also faced challenges in its legacy. While many monasteries were praised for their generosity, the inability of religious institutions to prevent widespread suffering shook faith for some. The famine deepened questions about divine justice and the role of earthly powers, planting seeds of doubt that would grow alongside calls for reform in centuries to come. Furthermore, the Great Famine's memory shaped cultural and historical consciousness. Chronicles, poems, and sermons recorded the suffering in vivid, often haunting detail. These accounts served as warnings about the dangers of hubris, environmental fragility, and social injustice. For many medieval people, the famine was a reminder of the precariousness of human life, the thin line between plenty and starvation. It became a foundational story, passed down to warn future generations of the consequences of neglecting the earth, society, and the bonds that hold communities together. The legacy of the famine also extended into the realms of governance and policy. The failures of local lords and monarchs to effectively manage food shortages prompted a slow evolution toward more centralized authority and regulations regarding grain markets and relief. While medieval governments remained limited in scope compared to modern states, the famine demonstrated the necessity for coordinated action in times of crisis. This would influence later medieval rulers as they sought to strengthen their control over economic and social life. In sum, the Great European Famine was not simply a tragedy of lost harvests and human lives. It was a catalyst for profound change, unsettling old structures and planting the seeds for a new medieval order. The decline in population loosened feudal bonds, shifted economic power, and encouraged agricultural innovation. The hardship bred both resilience and unrest, cooperation and conflict, faith and doubt. It shaped how medieval Europeans viewed the world, their place within it, and the delicate balance between human society and the natural environment. To live through those years, or to fail to survive even a single day, was to experience a crucible that tested every aspect of life. The famine's legacy, etched into the soil and spirit of Europe, would resonate through the centuries, shaping the trajectory of history and reminding us of the enduring human struggle to endure, adapt, and find hope amid devastation. Cultural reflections, art, literature, and memory of famine. The Great European Famine was not only a catastrophic event of loss and survival but also a profound moment etched deeply into the cultural memory of medieval Europe. It was a shadow that stretched far beyond the fields and villages, penetrating the manuscripts, songs, tales, and artistic expressions of the time. Though famine itself is often recorded in grim historical annals and chronicles, its echoes in art and literature reveal how deeply it scarred the collective psyche, shaping how medieval people understood suffering, survival, and the very fragility of human life. Famine in manuscripts and oral traditions. Medieval manuscripts, those painstakingly crafted texts illuminated with gold leaf and vivid pigments, offer some of the most poignant windows into the famine's cultural impact. Monasteries, the centers of learning and book production, often depicted scenes of scarcity and divine punishment with haunting clarity. Illuminated Bibles and prayer books contained miniature paintings showing emaciated figures, barren fields, and the anguished faces of peasants and clergy alike. These images were not merely artistic decoration, they served as theological commentary, visual sermons that underscored the belief that famine was a form of divine chastisement for human sinfulness. The stark contrast between rich, sumptuous iconography and the imagery of suffering reminded viewers that earthly wealth and spiritual poverty were inseparable, and that survival was tied to moral conduct as much as to earthly toil. Songs and ballads of the era carried the stories of hunger and loss into the oral tradition, ensuring that the memories of famine were passed down through generations in the rhythm of lament and warning. These songs often spoke in the voices of the starving, capturing the desperation, loneliness, and faint glimmers of hope that flickered in the darkest days. They were sung around fires in village halls and whispered in the corridors of castles, a shared cultural thread binding people across class and geography. Folk tales, too, grew around the famine's shadow, weaving narratives of survival, miraculous escapes, and tragic downfall. Some told of cursed lands where no crops would grow, or spirits angered by human greed, reflecting both the physical and spiritual toll of famine on medieval consciousness. Shaping the interpretation of future crises. The cultural memory of the Great Famine shaped the way later crises, particularly the Black Death, were understood and depicted. The devastating plague that swept Europe in the mid-14th century echoed many of the themes first etched into medieval minds by famine: death as divine punishment, the fragility of life, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. Chroniclers who wrote about the Black Death often referenced famine as a prelude, a warning sign that had gone unheeded. The famine's imagery and narratives formed a cultural framework through which subsequent generations interpreted suffering, survival, and moral reckoning. This artistic and literary legacy was inseparable from the broader social and religious milieu of the time. The Church, which had provided care and interpretation during the famine, became a primary lens through which the calamity was remembered. Religious art and literature emphasized themes of penance and redemption, urging people to see famine not only as a physical trial but as a spiritual journey. Pilgrimages, processions, and public prayers were depicted in manuscripts and chronicled in texts as acts of communal response, efforts to find meaning and solace in shared hardship. Everyday objects and enduring resilience. But beyond the grand religious narratives, the famine also found expression in the everyday objects and practices of medieval life. Pottery shards painted with crude images, graffiti on church walls, and even the design of tools and clothing bear subtle marks of the famine's imprint. The scars of hunger influenced how people lived, dressed, and worked, embedding the experience into the material culture. These traces remind us that cultural memory is not confined to grand monuments or texts but lives in the ordinary and the tactile, in the rhythms of daily existence. The famine's presence in cultural memory was both a source of trauma and a catalyst for resilience. Through art and storytelling, medieval communities grappled with their vulnerability and sought ways to affirm life in the face of death. The tales of survival, the prayers for mercy, and the images of endurance became forms of psychological sustenance, helping people to endure not only famine but the many hardships that would follow. This cultural inheritance informed not just how medieval people saw their world but how they imagined their future. In examining these reflections, it becomes clear why you wouldn't last a day in the Great European Famine, not only because of the physical challenges but because the famine demanded a constant negotiation with despair, faith, and the struggle to find meaning amid devastation. The art and literature that emerged from this dark chapter reveal a society forced to confront its limits, to question its beliefs, and to hold on to hope in the faintest of flickers. Ultimately, the cultural memory of the famine endures as a testament to the human capacity to witness suffering and to create from it something lasting: stories, songs, images that speak across centuries. They remind us that beneath the statistics of death and decline lie the lived experiences of countless individuals, whose voices found expression in the rich and often painful tapestry of medieval culture. Through this legacy, the Great European Famine remains more than history. It is a profound human story of loss, endurance, and the unyielding search for meaning. Lessons learned. What history teaches about food security. The Great European Famine, with all its grim details and harrowing consequences, was more than a tragic episode locked in medieval history. It stands as a profound lesson etched into the collective consciousness of humanity, a stark reminder of the delicate balance between survival and disaster that hinges on the systems by which societies secure their food. As we look back through the centuries, the famine's echoes ripple through modern agricultural practices, global supply chains, and the persistent vulnerabilities of human communities dependent on nature's whims. In this reflection, we uncover what has changed, what remains hauntingly familiar, and how history guides our understanding of food security today. Fragile systems and climatic vulnerability. At the heart of the medieval famine was a fragile system of agriculture, intricately dependent on weather patterns, crop cycles, and a limited variety of staple grains. The reliance on rye, barley, and wheat, combined with the era's rudimentary farming tools and methods, left vast populations vulnerable to even minor climatic shifts. The Little Ice Age, bringing colder temperatures and unpredictable rains, devastated harvests across the continent. This climatic instability was a natural phenomenon, but its impact was magnified by human systems that lacked resilience, systems without the technological means to store surplus effectively, diversify crops extensively, or transport food quickly across regions. Fast forward to the present, and the shadow of this vulnerability remains, albeit under a vastly different guise. Modern agriculture boasts machinery, advanced fertilizers, genetically improved seeds, and sophisticated irrigation systems that would have been unimaginable in medieval Europe. Our global food supply chains stretch across continents, delivering fresh produce and staple grains to cities and villages alike, theoretically buffering local shortages with imports from distant lands. Yet, this very interconnectedness reveals new fault lines. Dependence on complex logistics, just-in-time delivery, and concentrated production zones introduces risks of disruption from weather extremes, political conflicts, or pandemics. The COVID-19 crisis, for example, exposed how fragile these systems can be when borders close and transport grinds to a halt. Weather remains the ultimate arbiter of food security. Despite technological advances, agriculture is still at the mercy of climate. Unprecedented droughts, floods, and shifting seasons driven by climate change threaten to rewrite the rules of cultivation just as severely as the Little Ice Age once did. Regions that enjoyed reliable harvests now face erratic rainfall or rising temperatures that stress soil health and crop viability. Where medieval farmers struggled with unpredictable rains, modern farmers contend with wildfires, hurricanes, and prolonged droughts, extremes intensified by a warming planet. These changes test the capacity of contemporary systems to adapt swiftly and effectively, underscoring the persistent lesson that human survival is inseparable from ecological stability. The dangers of monoculture and social inequality. Moreover, historical famine teaches us about the dangers of monoculture and limited crop diversity. Medieval Europe's reliance on a narrow range of grains amplified the impact of crop failures. Today, while crop diversity has increased, global food production still depends heavily on a handful of staple crops like wheat, rice, and corn. This concentration poses a risk when diseases, pests, or climatic shocks target these staples, potentially triggering supply crises. The Irish potato famine centuries later underscored this same vulnerability, reminding us that genetic uniformity in crops can be a silent threat. In response, contemporary agricultural research promotes crop diversification, sustainable practices, and seed banks designed to safeguard genetic variety, efforts to build resilience against the unpredictable. The famine also brings into sharp focus the social dimensions of food security. Then, as now, access to food was often dictated not just by availability but by economic status, power dynamics, and political will. Medieval peasants, though producing much of the food, were often last in line for its distribution, squeezed by feudal obligations, tithes, and local market forces. This social inequality meant that even when food was scarce, those with power might hoard or control supplies, while the vulnerable starved. Modern societies have instituted food aid programs, welfare policies, and international organizations to mediate these inequalities, yet food insecurity persists in pockets worldwide. Hunger remains closely linked to poverty, displacement, and conflict, illustrating that the challenge of fair access is as old as famine itself. Guiding future food security. Reflecting on medieval responses to famine, such as royal price controls or church charity, reveals the enduring complexity of managing food crises. Governments today face similar dilemmas balancing market mechanisms, emergency relief, and long-term agricultural policy. Sometimes, interventions succeed. Other times, they falter or even worsen the problem, as hoarding, black markets, or political unrest intervene. The historical record cautions that top-down solutions must be paired with local knowledge, community resilience, and sustainable agricultural practices. Empowering farmers, diversifying economies, and investing in rural infrastructure emerge as critical strategies, informed by centuries of lessons on what works and what fails. Another key insight is the importance of knowledge sharing and technological innovation. Medieval farmers relied on generational wisdom, local observation, and communal cooperation to survive. Today, advances in agricultural science, climate modeling, and digital technology offer unprecedented tools to forecast risks, improve yields, and respond to threats. Yet, technology alone cannot erase vulnerability. It must be accessible and adapted to diverse contexts. The famine reminds us that a society's strength lies in its ability to learn, innovate, and mobilize resources swiftly in response to crises. Finally, the Great European Famine is a powerful reminder of human resilience and the persistent hope embedded in food security efforts. Despite the immense suffering, communities found ways to endure, through mutual aid, adaptive farming techniques, and cultural practices that celebrated survival. Today's food systems, while fragile, also carry this legacy of adaptation and hope. The challenge remains to honor this history by building systems that are not only productive but equitable, sustainable, and resilient against the uncertainties of an ever-changing climate. Personal stories. Voices from the famine. The year is 1316. The rain has not stopped for months. Fields lie drowned beneath gray skies, and the air smells of rot and mud. The roads are thick with silence, broken only by the groaning of carts that carry the dead or the desperate. No grand history book captures the weight of these moments in full. For that, you must turn to the quiet lives of those who endured, or didn't. In the midst of a ruined world, we listen to them. Etienne, the starving shepherd, northern France. Etienne no longer counts the days. He counts ribs. On his sheep. On himself. The hills above the Loire used to echo with the soft bleats of his flock, but now the sounds are brittle, more cough than call. The rain turned the pasture to sludge, and what little grass poked through in spring was pulled out by hand and chewed by man and beast alike. He used to live with his younger brother, Jean, in a timber hut half sunk into a knoll. Jean died last winter, his lips blue, his stomach swollen. Etienne buried him beneath the cold, hard mud, unable to dig deeper than a foot before the water filled the hole. He whispered a song, forgot the words halfway through, and closed the grave with a prayerless stone. Now Etienne moves between farms, eyes low, begging for scraps with the same voice he once used to barter wool. He traded his boots for a half loaf of barley bread last week. He hasn't seen a coin in months. Once, he stole a rotting turnip from a roadside basket. The guilt gnawed worse than hunger. But the hunger never stopped. One night, hiding under the collapsed beams of an abandoned mill, he dreams of spring. A real one, with dry ground, with lambs, with Jean still laughing about how city folk can't shear a sheep to save their lives. He wakes with tears on his face and mud on his tongue. He had tried to eat the corner of his own blanket. Agnes, the baker's wife, Eastcheap, London. In London, the stench of spoiled grain is masked only by the salt tang of the Thames and the smoke of too many fires burning too little wood. Agnes used to be proud of their bakery. St. Bartholomew's Lane had smelled of honeyed oat and spice in better years. But the wheat supply thinned with every ship that failed to dock, every merchant turned away by a city clutching famine at its throat. Her husband, Roger, was a tall man once, cheerful in the mornings. Now he is a shadow of flour and silence. He hasn't baked a proper loaf in 2 months. What flour they have, they stretch with sawdust, powdered nettle, and ground acorns. Agnes knows it makes people sick, but the line still forms every dawn. They sell to the constables first. Not for coin, but for protection. Theft has become bold. Once, a boy no older than 10 tried to climb through the bakery window to snatch a lump of dough before it baked. Roger caught him by the wrist. The boy didn't cry, didn't speak. He just stared back with eyes too old for his bones. That night, Agnes boiled leather, an old belt of her father's, softened in a pot until it split into ribbons. She chewed the pieces slowly, pretending they were noodles. Across from her, Roger wept without a sound. The next morning, he was gone. So was the last of the flour. She doesn't know where he went. Maybe to find grain. Maybe to steal. Maybe to die. Sister Marguerite, a convent outside Ghent, Flanders. The convent was built of old stones and older vows. Marguerite has lived within its walls since she was 13, long enough to see 3 abbesses come and go, and long enough to remember harvests thick with barley and praise. Now, the chapel is quieter than usual. Fewer voices sing in the mornings. Hunger has stolen their breath. They eat once a day, sometimes only broth. The root cellar is nearly empty, and the garden has flooded twice this month. The holy sisters wear heavier habits, not for modesty, but to warm their hollowed bodies. The wind whistles through the stone corridors, carrying prayers with it. Some are hopeful, some not. Marguerite has kept a journal since the rains began. Each entry shorter than the last. The ink grows thin, the parchment dear. She writes not for herself, but for the ones who will come after. If they come. February 2nd, year of our Lord 1317. One of the novices fainted at the altar today. We gave her apple peels and what we think was oat porridge. It may have been mouse-chewed grain. We are no longer certain what is clean. I do not think God tests us. I think he is weeping. Some days, Marguerite walks to the hill above the convent and stares at the sky. It is always gray. She does not pray for sunshine anymore. She prays for endurance. Last week, a peasant woman arrived at the convent gate with 2 children and a bundle of rags. Her husband had died on the road. They were turned away. The convent has nothing left to share. Marguerite knelt by the gate after they left, hands folded. Not in prayer, in apology. Jakob, the mill boy, near Mainz, Germany. Jakob is 12. He knows the smell of flour better than he knows his mother's voice. She died last spring, and father put him to work in the village mill to keep his hands full and his stomach fuller. But the mill hasn't turned properly since the river swelled and choked the wheel with debris. The grain at once ground arrives less often and in poorer condition, moldy, wet, crawling with beetles. Still, Jakob grinds it. He has learned not to gag. The miller, old man dieter, feeds him what's left in the sacks. Flour scrap soup, sometimes the gluey remnants of a dough gone wrong. Jakob dreams of meat but no longer remembers the taste. His cheeks have sunk in. His fingers look like roots. He once tried to steal grain for his sisters, two little girls with tangled hair and matching coughs. But Dieter caught him, didn't punish him, just looked at him, long and sad, then handed Jakob a scrap of boiled onion and said, "Next time, ask." There are rumors of thieves who set fire to mills for the grain. Jakob is afraid, but mostly, he's tired. His dreams are filled with the grinding stone's rhythm. Over and over, grain into powder, hunger into silence. Eleanor, the widow, York, England. Eleanor used to be a seamstress. Her fingers still twitch with the memory of thread. But now they are blistered, not from the needle, but from digging. Her son, Thomas, died last week, too weak to keep down the broth made of bitter roots and wild sorrel. She buried him behind the churchyard wall, where the soil is shallow and dry. The graveyard inside is full. She doesn't speak much. The hunger has hollowed her voice. But she still walks to the chapel every morning, lights a stub of candle, and sits. Watching, waiting, people talk of the end of days, of punishment and wrath. Eleanor believes only in the softness of her son's hand as it once clutched hers. That, she thinks, is more real than sermons. Sometimes, she hums the lullabies she used to sing when he was small. The melodies float like ghosts in the empty chapel. These are not grand figures of history. They are not kings or cardinals. They are not named in chronicles. But they lived the famine in full, in their bones, their bellies, their prayers, and their silences. Their stories, imagined though they are drawn from truth. From records. From accounts written in margins, etched in stained glass, whispered across centuries. They remind us of the cost, of what it means to go without. And they ask, without a word, if it were you, would you have lasted even a day? Modern parallels, comparing medieval and contemporary famines. The Great European Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands as a stark testament to the fragility of human societies when confronted with the caprices of nature and the limitations of their own institutions. Yet, as we traverse the corridors of history, we find that the specter of famine has not been confined to the medieval past. The 20th century, despite its technological advancements and global interconnectedness, bore witness to famines that mirrored the tragedies of earlier times, revealing recurring patterns of neglect, environmental failure, and human error. Echoes from the 19th and 20th centuries. In the mid-19th century, Ireland suffered a calamity that would etch itself into the national consciousness, the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852. A potato blight devastated the primary food source of the Irish peasantry, leading to the deaths of approximately 1 million people and the emigration of another million. While the blight was a natural phenomenon, the disaster was exacerbated by British governmental policies that prioritized economic liberalism over humanitarian aid. Relief efforts were minimal and often mismanaged, reflecting a broader indifference to the plight of the Irish populace. The famine not only decimated the population but also left a lasting impact on Irish society and its relationship with Britain. Fast forward to the early 1930s, and the Soviet Union becomes the stage for another human-made catastrophe, the Holodomor in Ukraine. Under Stalin's regime, aggressive collectivization policies and grain requisition quotas led to widespread starvation. Farmers were forced to surrender their harvests to the state, leaving little to sustain themselves. The government's refusal to acknowledge the famine and its suppression of information prevented any meaningful relief efforts. Estimates suggest that between 2.6 and 3.9 million Ukrainians perished during this period. The Holodomor serves as a grim reminder of how political ideologies and authoritarian governance can directly lead to mass suffering. During World War II, the Bengal region of British India experienced a devastating famine in 1943. Despite adequate food production, wartime inflation, hoarding, and British colonial policies disrupted food distribution, leading to the deaths of an estimated 2.1 million people. The British government's focus on the war effort, coupled with its reluctance to divert resources to the colony, contributed significantly to the crisis. The Bengal famine underscores how economic and political priorities can overshadow humanitarian needs, resulting in catastrophic outcomes. In the 1980s, Ethiopia faced a famine that captured global attention. A combination of severe drought and ongoing civil conflict led to the deaths of approximately 300,000 to 1.2 million people. The Ethiopian government's policies, including forced resettlements and restrictions on aid, exacerbated the crisis. International response was initially slow, but media coverage eventually spurred a global humanitarian effort. The Ethiopian famine highlights the complex interplay between environmental factors and political decisions in the genesis and resolution of food crises. Common threads and enduring lessons. These modern famines, though separated by time and geography, share common threads with the Great European Famine. In each case, natural events such as crop failures or droughts were compounded by human actions, or inactions, that turned hardship into catastrophe. Governmental neglect, policy failures, and socio-political dynamics played pivotal roles in the escalation of these crises. Moreover, these famines reveal how vulnerable populations often bear the brunt of such disasters. In medieval Europe, peasants and the urban poor suffered the most, lacking the means to procure scarce resources. Similarly, in Ireland, Ukraine, Bengal, and Ethiopia, marginalized communities faced disproportionate suffering, highlighting enduring patterns of inequality and social stratification. The recurrence of famine throughout history, even in the modern era, challenges the notion that technological progress alone can safeguard societies against such tragedies. It underscores the importance of effective governance, equitable resource distribution, and proactive disaster management. As we reflect on these events, we are reminded that vigilance, compassion, and responsive leadership are crucial in preventing the repetition of history's darkest chapters. Conclusion: the fragility and strength of humanity. The rain has stopped now. The soil lies damp, its muddy furrows still holding the memory of countless footprints, some hurried, others slow, many never retraced. The air is hushed, as if the land itself remembers the suffering, the silence of fields once full of life now fallen quiet. In that quiet, beneath the stillness of the passing centuries, echoes remain, the whispered prayers of mothers, the hunger-racked cries of children, the dry coughs of the dying, and the stubborn heartbeat of those who endured. This famine, the Great Famine, was not merely a footnote in history. It was a test of every fiber that holds humanity together. Nature cracked the earth, soaked it with endless rain, drowned the seeds, withered the hope of harvest. But it was not just the skies that turned against them. It was the world they had built. A world with narrow margins for error, with lords who counted grain more carefully than lives, with markets that served profit more readily than need, and with institutions too slow or too proud to adapt. In this landscape, even the strong were brought low, and the weak, as ever, bore the deepest wounds, enduring amidst devastation. Yet in this chapter of devastation, there lies something else. Something quieter, harder to see, but no less real. Beneath the hunger, beneath the fear and the grief, there was a stubborn thread of human endurance, fragile, but never fully severed. A mother, who had not eaten in days, pressed the last piece of blackened rye into her child's hand, smiling weakly as though it were a feast. A monk, thin and trembling, carried pails of gruel from the monastery kitchens to those collapsed in the roads outside its gates. A village, gaunt with starvation, gathered around a fire to sing songs passed down from grandmothers, reminding them they were still alive, still a people. These are not stories of triumph in the traditional sense. There were no heroes with swords, no glorious salvation. But there was survival, and that, in such times, was its own form of victory. The famine did not pass in a single season. It lingered, ruthlessly, slowly, cruelly. It returned in waves, sometimes stronger, sometimes just long enough to prevent recovery. Some lands fared slightly better, others far worse. In many villages, death came so often that the act of mourning became ritualized and subdued, a whisper rather than a wail. In cities, dogs and rats fought over scraps in the alleyways, while merchants hid what grain they could behind locked doors, afraid of the desperate knock in the night. But even as the world grew harder, colder, more brutal, the people did not vanish. Resilience and rebuilding. They tilled again. When the sun returned, briefly, cautiously, they planted seeds. Some had fled to forests and fields, becoming wanderers in their own homelands. Others had stayed behind to bury neighbors and rebuild the fragile scaffolding of their lives. No matter how broken, they kept building. The scars of the famine were carried in bodies, in memories, in the very soil, but they walked forward all the same. Church bells rang not only to mark death, but also to summon the faithful. Processions wound through muddy streets, bearing wooden crosses, weeping for sins they could not name but believed had brought divine wrath. And still, even then, candles were lit. Psalms were sung. The light of belief, however flickering, was not extinguished. In hunger, in despair, the human spirit searched for meaning. And in that search, it found community. The Great Famine reshaped everything it touched. It weakened the old order. It exposed the limits of the feudal promise that the Lord would protect, that the land would provide. In the decades that followed, peasants began to ask different questions, to demand better answers. The famine did not start a revolution, but it sowed seeds of discontent, of agency. It made clear that even the sacred bonds of duty and service could fray when the stomach went empty. The unyielding will to live. And yet, it also brought people together in unexpected ways. Food was shared more often than hoarded. Priests gave from their own larders. Women gathered wild herbs and nettles, boiled them into bitter soups for entire families. Children, their ribs like branches, still played when they could, chasing wooden hoops through alleyways, laughing when laughter seemed impossible. Life clung on. That is the great contradiction of famine. Its brutality makes the smallest acts of kindness enormous. To offer a crust of bread becomes heroic. To listen to another's sorrow becomes sacred. The most ordinary parts of human life, comfort, warmth, dignity, become precious beyond gold. And in the face of that loss, people still tried. That effort, however doomed, however faint, speaks more loudly than any royal decree or church edict. History has often remembered the Great Famine as a precursor, a warning bell before the louder horrors of the Black Death that followed. But it was more than that. It was its own apocalypse. It tested the limits of humanity not only physically but morally. And it revealed that even in collapse, human beings carry within them a will that resists erasure. You, listening now, may be safe in your bed, the quiet hum of a world beyond famine lulling you toward sleep. You have not heard your stomach cry out for a week. You have not watched snow fall into your bowl and counted it as your evening meal. You have not had to choose which of your children might live another day. But someone once did, and someone, many someones, endured that choice, that hunger, that grief. And still they held on. Not because they were braver or stronger than you, but because life is stubborn. Hope, irrational as it is even more so. And in the long memory of history, they are not forgotten. Their suffering has become part of our story. Their perseverance part of our inheritance. They walked roads of mud and sorrow so that eventually, centuries later, someone might write their story, and someone else might listen. So as you close your eyes, let the fields of that time recede into the mist. Let the cold soften. Let the hunger fade. Let the soft hum of the past settle gently over you. The famine came. The famine passed. And in its wake, people remained. And that, fragile, tired, aching, is strength.